Mikhail Viktorovich, it's very curious what you think about the USSR. That is, with regard to the USSR, both its emergence and its destruction. Because there are a lot of different conflicting opinions on these two themes. I'm just going to voice a couple of them first. First, about the formation. There is one picture that was shown to us in the Soviet Union, that Russia is a prison of peoples, everything was bad there, the Tsar tyrannized everyone, absolutely terrible power. Then the people revolted, and we got the free USSR. And another opinion, which they began to impose on us after the collapse of the USSR in the 90s, is that everything was fine in Russia. The Tsar was a fine fellow, a holy guy. And then the evil Bolsheviks took it all and destroyed it. German spies led by Lenin. And about the collapse of the USSR, there are also two polar opinions. Some say that in the USSR, by the end, everything was bad. Nothing worked there as it had to. The party was on top and skimmed all the fat and cream. For those from below, there was nothing left. Therefore, the people were also terribly dissatisfied and overthrew this party along with the USSR. In such a way it happened. And the second opinion is that the USSR is an earthly paradise and everything was wonderful there. But the enemies, beat us in the Cold War, and this paradise was destroyed.
All of these variants are primitive, and by reason of their primitiveness, they are inadequate. In order to understand what the USSR is, one must understand what globalization is. Moreover, not in the form as it took shape in the second half of the 20th century, but in the form in which it was already in the 19th century. Let's look at it like this. The leader of civilizational development in line with the biblical project at that time is Great Britain. The British Empire stretches across all hemispheres in such a way that the sun never sets on its territory. On the internet, there is a map where all the countries with which Great Britain has ever been at war are filled in pink. Besides Antarctica, there are few white spots where British troops have never been and did not manage to fight with anyone. That is, this is the historical reality of that era. Great Britain was engaged in global politics at that time. Now let's take a look at Russia. What is in Russia? On the one hand, it seems like orthodoxy is also based on the Bible, but on the other hand, it is autocephalous and does not obey the Pope, does not obey the English king or queen as the head of the Church of England. In addition to everything, orthodoxy will not look at Judaism in the way that many enlightened children in Europe would like. And this was expressed in the famous case that happened to Pobedonostsev. He was described in different editions by Piku and by some of the publicists before 1917. But the essence is simple. Pobedonostsev was resting somewhere at sea and fell into the water. He was saved by a Jew. Pobedonostsev woke up, looked at him, asked, "Are you a Yid?" "I'm a Yid. Cross yourself." That is, Judaism was tolerated as a delusion. They were incapable of genocide, such as the genocide of the Third Reich, despite individual excesses with pogroms. And anyhow, they wanted to somehow do this so that the Jewish diaspora would eventually become normal, orthodox subjects of Russia. That is, it is in itself a break on the implementation of the biblical project. Then things start related to what is commonly called autocracy. Autocracy is a state power that implements the entire function of governance. That is, it is not at all necessarily a monarchy. But the reality of the historical Russian Empire is such that the carrier of autocracy was the more or less effective head of the state, that is, the sovereign emperor. Sergei Tsiensky, in one of his novels, quotes a letter from Nikolai I to the King of the Belgians. I cannot understand how you could humiliate yourself like that. You were an officer of my God. In general, the position is clear. Nikolai II, in the materials of the first census of the Russian Empire of 1897, also writes, "the owner of the Russian land." That is, these are also claims on the theme that we are ruling Russia according to the entire function. And as for outside interference in Russian politics, internal and external, we do not care. We will eradicate and prevent it as much as we can. That is, if you look at the situation of the Russian Empire from the side of those who ruled global politics, such a power has no right to exist. Something needs to be done. The next question is connected with capitalism. Capitalism in any state can exist in two variants. Capitalism under the control of the national bourgeoisie and its own state, and capitalism under the control of the transnational bourgeoisie, which its own state must serve. Here in Russia, capitalism developed along the first path, capitalism under the control of the imperial bourgeoisie, which must be allegiant in relation to the monarchy. That is, at the level of the economy, something is also obtained that is not what the higher-ups of global politics would like. Further, if we talk about what capitalism was like, if you look at the economic processes that took place in Russia, then, in the Russian Empire, capitalism was immediately built state monopolistically, bypassing the stage of wild capitalism. It, if it was, then immediately after the abolition of serfdom, and was very short, because many enterprises were bought into the treasury. Or there was a powerful state sector that was originally, going back to the times of Peter the Great, state-owned factories, which, in general, in many sectors controlled a fair share of the market. That is, also capitalism in the Russian Empire was wrong. This is when you look at the level of global politics. But if you look from the internal level at what is happening here, the real powerlessness of the common people is a fact, because the principle, the law is like a drawbar, where you turn it, there it goes, it always worked in the Russian Empire. And besides, the law worked more or less normally, only within the boundaries of certain corporations. That is, if the squabble is within the nobility, then yes, it is normal. If the merchants are touched, then according to the hierarchy of the stratum, you can wipe your feet on the merchants and further downward to the common people. There was such an interesting episode. In the Russian Museum, in two adjacent halls, there turned out to be simultaneously two pictures on the theme of one and the same logistical task. The first picture is Ilya Efimovich Repin, barge haulers on the Volga. A barge haulers harnessed, pulling this barge. In the next room there was a very small watercolor, which you could not immediately notice on the wall. The plot is basically the same, but there are variations. A river somewhere in Europe, a barge on the river, two men on the barge, a rope along the river, not barge haulers on the rope, but two horses, and someone drives the horses. Further, the question arises, what is it with these barge haulers? The guys have nothing to do? No gym? They go there to improve their health and everything is fine? It turns out that when Ilya Yefimovich was painting this picture, the barge haulers on average earned 30 kopecks a day. For 30 kopecks a day in Moscow, it was possible to cross Moscow in a cab from end to end in one direction. That is, factually, the barge haulers worked for grub, for 30 kopecks a day, worked to the point of wear and tear, and were hardly satisfied with their lives. Further is the question of mortality statistics. If we analyze the statistics of mortality in the 19th century, then it was as follows. Half of those born died before the age of 10. Of the survivors, half died before 40. Those who crossed the 40-year mark, they generally lived up to different ages, including the 100-year mark, because when they celebrated the centenary of the Battle of Borodino, they found 5 veterans of the Russian wars that, well, if they did not participate in the Battle of Borodino, then they participated in that war. Well, if you browse the internet in search engines, a soldier of 3 emperors, there is described one private who began to serve almost under Paul I and finished his service under Alexander II, and at the age as follows of over 80 during the Russian-Turkish War of 1878, he lost his leg and after that continued to serve.
Во время русско-турецкой войны 1878 года он потерял ногу и после этого продолжал служить.
That is, those who crossed the 40-year mark, they crossed it not thanks to social protection, but thanks to the fact that they initially had health. And these difficult living conditions in the Russian Empire, they were not able to kill them. Again, I said, if you want to know history, then you need to read not only textbooks, but also fiction corresponding to the era. So, one of the writers of the 19th century describes the Nikolai soldier. The man served, if I am not mistaken, Liskov describes this, served 25 years in the Nikolai army, and, being an old man, he prayed every day for the innocent victims. When they asked him how, why, and he said that it was the letting through the Green Street. When 2 lines of soldiers stood and whipped the guilty with gauntlets, many people died. Well, these are the times of Nikolai, the middle of the 19th century. 20th century, read literature too. In general, the living conditions were difficult. Social guarantees and social protection for the common man were at 0. And if you read the memoirs of the Gendarme General Spiridovich, he describes the fact that when at the end of the 1890s, labor legislation was being developed, the police stood on the side of the workers. And Witte stood on the side of the capitalists and minimized all the social guarantees that the police wanted to reflect in this very labor legislation. The position of the police is understandable. In that era, the bulk of the population were, after all, believers, and far from everyone wanted to shoot at the rioters in the square to take the sin of murder on their souls. Therefore, the police were interested in carrying out reforms that over time would minimize social tensions. And capitalism was interested in using force to maintain the system as it is, since, with the exceptional cheapness of labor, all other things being equal, it ensured the high competitiveness of domestic products, including on world markets. The next question is connected with the level of industrial development. What was the situation with scientific technological progress? Well, on the one hand, yes, there really were epoch-making ideas: Popov, radio, Sikorsky, a multi-engine plane, Ryabushinsky, a typical millionaire, the factual creator of what is now called TSAGI, Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute. Well, if you look as a whole, what? Shipbuilding is an integrating industry that integrates everything. Take the Aurora, a symbol of the revolution and a typical ship of the Russian fleet of that era. So it turns out that the conception of this class of ships can be called idiotic. Why? Because the Aurora, in her original form, possessed excessive weapons for the sinking of a merchant steamer or sailing ship on which trade was carried out at that time. And the task of the cruisers was to suppress, first of all, enemy trade. But the Aurora could not withstand a battle with a comparable in artillery power enemy, by force of the fact that she was not armored in the due way for battle. This was expressed in the extreme most vivid form on the Varyag. She is not a combat vessel at all, but a crock built for parades. 45 minutes of battle, the ship is incapacitated because everyone who was on the upper deck, almost all are wounded. There is no one to service the guns. Aurora in the form in which she is now. This is already taking into account the Russian-Japanese War. Any trash that littered her initially, like the 37mm cannons, the 75mm cannons, were removed, and after that, the 6-inch guns were added. In the form in which she is, it's no longer as she was initially. It's already a certain reaction. That is, the ruling elite could not formulate the correct tactical and technical requirements in order to build a warship that would meet the requirements of the era. And Aurora is no exception in this respect. Tsushima didn't teach anything. Those dreadnoughts that were built for the First World War, and they did not manage to build, if we relate to that era, are the same rubbish as the Aurora and the Varyag. If you turn to the filling, licensed French guns, armor, either imported or licensed, electrical equipment, either imported or licensed, that is, if we touch on the high tech of that era, then complete technological dependence on foreign countries. What are the prospects in such a variant? None. Because even if the First World War with the participation of Russia does not take place, and Russia continues to evolve just as slowly, then when the opponents mature, there will be an invasion, and if it is repelled, then it will only be repelled with a lot of blood.
когда противники созреют, будет нашествие, и если оно будет отражено, то будет отражено только большой кровью. Поэтому, если говорить о
Therefore, if we
внутренней
talk about the
обстановке в
internal
стране,
situation in the
то
country, it was
было
full to the brim of
полно-полно
problems
проблем,
that
которые
Tsarism was
царизм
not going to solve,
решать не собирался. И они как-то
and they were somehow
решались
solved
спонтанным
spontaneously,
образом
pushing their way through the
бюрократическим
bureaucratic
способом.
method of governance.
Бюрократический способ правления. Это вот
This is the
внутреннее
internal state of the
состояние.
empire,
Потому что если
because if
проводить
we draw
параллели,
parallels,
допустим, с
say, with the
японской
Japanese
историей,
empire,
то
then
Япония
Japan implemented the
реализовала
scenario
сценарий
of
ущербного
evolutionary development
развития
after the
после
Meiji
реставрации
Restoration,
Мэйдзи
1867.
1867 год. Россия
Russia
отменила
abolished serfdom in
авторитаризацию в
1861,
1861 году, и сценарий
and the
эволюционного
Romanovs could not
развития
implement the scenario
параллельно
of
велся
evolutionary
в Москве.
development.
Dальше, понимаете,
Further, you see,
получается
it
так,
turns out
что
in such a way
если
that
в стране
if in the
есть
country there is
недовольство,
discontent,
то
then there
всегда
will always be
найдутся
external
внешние
curators
регуляторы,
who will
которые
realize
это
this
недовольство
discontent
будут
for their own
реализовывать
political
в
objectives
своих
in relation to this
действиях
country.
по отношению к этой стране. В большинстве своем внешние
For the most
кураторы
part, external
не
curators are not
обеспокоены
concerned
тем,
about
чтобы
bringing a country with
вывести
discontent to a
страну,
level
в
where
которой
it could
есть
independently solve its
недовольство, на
problems and
уровень,
develop.
когда
They are
правительство
interested in using its
создает
resources in
общественные
their own
проблемы
interests,
и
that
развивается.
is,
Они
in the country being an
заинтересованы в том,
object of
чтобы
exploitation.
использовать ее ресурсы в своих интересах, то есть чтобы страна была объектом эксплуатации. И,
And
соответственно,
accordingly,
если
if
в
there is
стране
discontent
есть
in the country,
недовольство,
then external
внешние
curators will
кураторы
finance this
будут
discontent,
финансировать это недовольство и
and the revolution,
революция
indeed,
действительно по
in
объемам
terms of the volume of
инвестиций
investments in
было бы
it, is
сопоставимо с
comparable to the
военными
military budgets
бюджетами
of the
ведущих
leading powers of that era,
держав той эпохи. Потому что
because only in 1905,
1905
the Bund,
год
this is one of the
это
revolutionary
одна из
parties purely
революционных
Jewish in
партий,
composition,
сугубо
received
еврейского
more than 3
происхождения,
million rubles in gold.
получил более 3 миллионов рублей золотом,
And in
а
order to
чтобы
understand
обеспечить
what 3 million rubles in gold were in those days,
на
the
строительство
construction cost of the same Aurora was
6,3
6.3 million rubles in gold.
То есть объемы
That is, the volume of
инвестиций в
investments in the
революцию были
revolution was
колоссальны.
colossal.
И как опять же
And as
отмечают
representatives of the Gendarme
представители
Corps again
этих
noted,
жандармов, прокламации,
the
которые
proclamations that were
изымались в
confiscated
ходе
during
обысков в
searches in St.
Петербурге,
Petersburg,
прокламации,
and the
которые
proclamations that
изымались
were
из
confiscated from prisoners in
немецких
Japanese camps,
лагерях,
were
были
printed in one and
напечатаны
the
в
same
одной и
printing
той же
house.
типографии.
This is one and the
Картина
same
тоже
quantity of
ясна.
circulation.
То есть революция – это глобальный проект.
That
Сводить
is,
все
the
дело к
revolution
тому, что
was a
наши
global project.
коварные немцы
To
обеспечили
reduce the whole matter to the fact that the
финансирование
insidious Germans
Ленин шпион
ensured the departure of
германский,
Lenin and financed him,
это значит
and Lenin is a
скрывать
German
истинное
spy,
положение вещей.
this means to hide the true state of affairs.
Соединилась
Because if Germany joined the financing of the revolution during the First World War,
Первой мировой
then
войны,
these
эти
volumes were
объемы,
crumbs in
крохотные,
comparison with what the
сопоставимы с
British
тем,
and
что уже
Americans
успели
had
накачать
already managed to pump into this
англичане и
project.
американцы в этот проект. Если говорить
If we
о
talk
том,
about how
как
Lenin
относились
related to the
Ленин
cooperation with
к
the German General
сотрудничеству с
Staff,
германским
then
генеральным
the
штабом,
relation
то
was simple.
отношение было
If the
простое.
Germans are
Если
such
немцы
idiots that
такие
they are ready to
идиоты,
invest in our
которые
revolution
планируют
so that our
разразить
revolution
революцию,
then
для
splashes
того,
out
чтобы
into
наша
Germany and
революция
sweeps away not
помогла
only
не
the
только
Russian monarchy,
германии,
but also the
смогла не
German,
только
well, let
российскую
them invest.
монархию, но и германскую, ну пусть вкладываются. То есть Ленин,
That is,
он не
Lenin did not
считал
consider
себя
himself a German spy, a
немецким
German
шпионом,
agent.
немецкой агентурой. Это был долговременный
It was a
проект, в
long-term
котором
project in
Германия,
which
как
Germany,
империя,
as an
от
empire,
которой Россия
on which Russia,
фактически не
including the
может
Bolsheviks,
считаться
were
зависимой,
somehow
она была
dependent,
исчезнута.
had to disappear.
Потом есть еще
Then there is such a
такая
thing.
вещь. Ее в
In
постсоветские
post-Soviet
времена и
times,
в
in the late Soviet
позднесоветские
times,
времена как-то
it was
понимать
somehow
трудно.
not customary to understand this.
Это вопрос,
This is the
связанный с
question related
эксплуатацией
to the
человека
exploitation of
человеком.
man by man.
Ну, эксплуатация
The exploitation
человека
of man by
в
man in
марксизме
Marxism
понимается
is
как
understood as a
следствие
consequence of
частной
private ownership
собственности на
of the means of
средства
production.
производства. Но если
But if you
смотреть
look more
более
broadly,
широко, то
in
для
order for a
того, чтобы
person to
человек
become an object of
стал объектом
exploitation, or at
эксплуатации,
least to be suitable
или
for
хотя бы
this,
был пригоден для этого,
it is
необходимо
necessary to first
предварительно
ensure the oppression of
обеспечить
the development of his
объективное
organism,
развитие
that is,
его
so that he would be
организма,
biologically inferior in something.
биологически чем-то неполноценным. После того,
After the
как
biological
достигнут
inferiority of the
биологической
organism is
неполноценности
achieved,
организма,
then there
дальше
follow
следующие
socio-cultural factors,
социологические факторы,
defective formations,
субъективное образование,
suppression of
подавление
personal will,
личностной воли, и тогда
and further there
получается
turns out in general a zombie
зомби,
who is
который
governed either
командует
by direct
либо
commands
по прямой
or in an
команде, либо в
automatic mode,
автоматическом режиме,
and he can be an object of exploitation on the part of those who are
эксплуатировать
biologically
тех,
less
кто
defective than he is,
биологически
at least to have received a
дефективен,
better education in
либо
a certain sense,
получил в некотором смысле
and are
более
able to realize their knowledge and
высокое
skills in
образование,
areas where the former
свои
cannot.
знания и навыки может реализовать в тех областях, где первый не может. Поэтому, хотя вопрос об
Therefore, although
эксплуатации
the question of the
человека
exploitation of man by
является
man in liberal mythology is
мифологией
considered
создаваемой
Marxist
марксистской
propaganda,
пропагандой,
allegedly an entrepreneur
политическое
is not an
решение
exploiter,
предпринимать
he is a
его
creator of
эксплуататором
jobs, he is a
состоит в
benefactor in
наличии
relation to the rest of the
негатива
masses,
по отношению
and if this rest of the masses do not like the way they live,
Если этой
then
остальной
they need to
массе не
work
нравится,
harder,
как она
master
живет,
more
не может
powerful
дальше
professions,
работать,
increase their
свободной
competitiveness in the labor market,
конкурентоспособности
and the market,
профессии,
there is no
повышать
subjective
свою
will, the market will
конкурентоспособность
regulate
рынок
everything
труда,
itself,
а
the
рынок
market is an objective
как рынок
regulator of the economy
субъективной
in
воли
accordance with social
сам
needs.
все отрегулирует, рынок объективный регулятор экономики в соответствии с общественными потребностями. В умолчаниях
In the
остается то,
default
что
remains the
финансовый
fact
климат
that the
создается
financial climate
банковской
is created by the banking system. Usury as a
ростовщический
factor,
фактор,
crediting at interest,
указание под
the
процент,
distribution of crediting over the sectors and
распределение
regions,
по
the
отраслям и
distribution
регионам,
of debt maturities,
распределение
the
сроков
distribution of debt
погашения
repayment volumes,
задолженности, распределение объемов
these are all means
погашения
of macroeconomic
задолженности. Это
governance
все
that
средства
destroy this liberal
макроэкономического
myth on the theme
управления,
that the market
которые и
is an objective
разрушают
regulator that
либеральную
is not
систему,
subjugated to
потому что
subjective will,
это объективный регулятор, который
and therefore it expresses some kind of objective justice in the aspect of production and distribution of goods.
справедливость в аспекте производства и распределения благ.
So, the
Эксплуатация
exploitation of man by
человека
man
человеком
exists.
существует. Марксизм
Marxism declared in those
декларирует
days the
те
building of a
времена
society in which all
построение
people would be
общества,
free
которое
from the
всегда
exploitation of
будет
man by man.
свободно от эксплуатации человека человеком. Но марксизм,
But Marxism, as a
как
system,
система, как
as a
система
sociological economic
экономическая
theory,
теория,
it does not
не
ensure the achievement of
обеспечивает
this result
достижение
for
этого
two
результата
simple
по
reasons.
двум причинам. Первое. Философия
First, the
диалектического
philosophy of
материализма,
dialectical
она
materialism
изначально
is initially
дефективна,
defective,
потому что
because Hegel replaced
подменяет
dialectics as the art of
теорию
revealing non-determinacies
устройства
and resolving them by means of
изменения
posing questions with a certain logic.
решения путем постановки вопросов некой логикой. Марксизм эту
Marxism
логику
inherited this logic
псевдодиалектику
pseudo-dialectics,
назвал
called
диалектикой.
it dialectics.
В
In Marxism, the fundamental question of philosophy is what is primary, what is secondary, matter or consciousness. The fundamental question of any practically significant philosophy is the question of the predictability of consequences and the choice from a variety of variants of the best one that ensures the achievement of some objectives at the lowest cost or in the shortest time. That is, already at the level of philosophy, Marxism leads away from the problematics of governance. Further, the political economy of Marxism is metrologically inconsistent because it is built on fictions that really do not exist in economic life. Such categories as necessary labor, necessary labor time, surplus labor time, they do not exist. And such a thing as the transfer of value from the means of production to products, this is nothing more than a counting operation subject to current legislation and not some kind of process which really takes place in the course of economic activity. Plus, the labor theory of value, it is more or less functionally operable only when we are dealing with mass typical works that are performed in a standard way, and therefore it is possible to estimate time. And if time is estimated, then it's possible to estimate also how much a person has to be paid in order that he could live and engage in these activities. As soon as it comes to unique creative works, then it turns out that what one can do in passing in a few seconds, the other is not able to do his whole life. Accordingly, Marxist political economy and scientific technological progress are also poorly compatible. It cannot be a tool for governance towards scientific technological progress. And then what remains in Marxism? All that remains is a slogan. We will build a kingdom of freedom. There will be communism, where to each according to his needs, and from each according to his ability. That is, such were the starting conditions by the time that happened, which marked the beginning of the collapse of the Russian Empire. That is, until the moment when the Russian Empire was drawn into the First World War without any need in order to. With Germany, there were certain contradictions because Germany, taking advantage of the Russian devastation after the Russo-Japanese War and Revolution, wanted to seize the moment and build the Baghdad Railway to the Persian Gulf. And at the time of Alexander III, the concession for the construction of railways had already been sold to Russia. In addition to this, there was also such an episode that Austria-Hungary did not like the independent Balkan powers, and she, too, was not averse to gobbling them up for her imperial purposes. And Berlin supported Austria-Hungary again on the principle of seize the moment while Russia cannot intervene. The Germans in general correctly assessed the military technical, military economic potential of Russia and relied on the hope that Russia would simply eat the dust and they would be able to complete this project. In addition, those who believe that Nikolai is a saint, they should remember the history of the Bjork Treaty. The bottom line is simple. Nikolai II was on vacation on the yacht Standard in the Finnish Skerries near the island of Bjork. Well, the Emperor of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, arrived there on the yacht Hohenzollern, and Wilhelm slipped to Nikolai to sign the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation, which stipulated that if someone attacked Germany, then Russia would support Germany with all its might. And if someone attacks Russia, then Germany will also support Russia with all its might. Nikolai signed this agreement. The then naval minister, Admiral Birilyov, who was on the yacht at the time, also signed it. Then Wilhelm left for Germany. The holidays were over, the Tsar arrived in St. Petersburg, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs kicked up a great fuss and categorically refused to allow this treaty to go into effect. After that, Russia denounced this treaty with a plausible pretext that it would enter into force if France joined it. The subtlety is in the fact that if you read the Bjork Treaty as it is available on the internet, that if Germany attacks France, Russia is not obliged to help Germany. But if France attacks Germany, then Russia is obliged to help Germany. Well, now let's go back to 1814, the pre-war time. Russia announces mobilization, and the Tsar sends a telegram to Berlin that he gives his word of honor that mobilization does not mean an automatic declaration of war. If you look at this situation from Berlin, then firstly, in his diaries, Wilhelm II honestly admits that he hates the Slavs with every fiber of his soul, understands that this is a sin before God, but can do nothing about it. This is one side of the question. The second side of the question is that he receives a telegram from a person who gives his word of honor. After, less than 10 years before, he simply wiped his feet on the agreement that he had signed. That is, if we again analyze how the First World War arose, it turns out that the script writers and conductors were Great Britain, and the German and Russian empires fell victims of the British scenario. Further, in general, the Bolsheviks from 1914 to 1917 could not make their contribution to the collapse of the empire for the simple reason that there were very few of them. Many activists were in exile or were abroad. The working class was apolitical, contrary to the historical myth that can be recognized from the course of history of the CPSU. Who was politically active? And the intelligentsia was politically active. So the book by Nikolai Nikolaevich Yakovlev, called August 1st, 1914, shows how the liberal intelligentsia and the liberal bourgeoisie sabotaged the waging of the war by the government of Nikolai II. And in fact, they brought down the empire. Further, the question arises, what do the Bolsheviks have to do with it? And despite the fact that the liberals, as always, they live in a pluralism of opinions. That is, there are a lot of opinions, every liberal understands a lot about himself, is filled with complacency, he does not listen to others. The state cannot be governed on the basis of pluralism of opinions. Further, there were two variants. Either professionals come and restore governability, and the only question is, what kind of professionals will they be? Because if we talk in essence, many white migrants were subsequently amazed as to why Kerensky betrayed Kornilov. If Kerensky had supported Kornilov, then Kornilov would have become a military dictator, he would have brought order to the country, and there would have been no Bolsheviks. Well, what would have been? There would be another year or two when the army would cruelly pacify all kinds of riots. That is, to say that in the event of Kornilov's arrival, history would have been less bloody, well, perhaps less bloody in the sense that it would have done without foreign intervention. But Kerensky did in general everything so that Kornilov did not come to power. But the liberals could not hold on to power, and they had to wait for a second Kornilovshchina. But Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and Lev Davidovich Trotsky managed to do it earlier. As a result, what arose, arose. Further, you see, any period after a state coup d'etat, it takes time to restore state governance. Therefore, in one of the past recording sessions, I said that it would be useful to give a course on organizing state coups d'etat and restoring governance after them. This course could largely prevent such situations, because this course would show that a state coup d'etat can be accomplished only in the case when the special services turn a blind eye to it as a minimum, and as a maximum, they actively participate and lead in it. The position of the special services can be justified by what Count Palin said to Paul. Yes, there is a conspiracy against you. I am leading it in order to suppress it in time. The position is convincing, unbreakable, until such time as a state coup d'etat takes place and state governance begins. But if you look at what views the Bolsheviks had about what would happen the day after they took state power, then it was assumed that everything would somehow by itself be fine, but that this case required certain knowledge, skills, and professionalism. About this, in the materials of the 6th Congress of the RSDLP, which took place in August-September 1917 in Petrograd, there is not a single word. Only emotions on the theme that we will take power, we will be happy, the people will be happy, and everything will be fine. And the fact that they were to face sabotage, they were to face an absence of governorial professionalism in the ranks of even their supporters. No one thought about that. The second side of the question is that as a result of the state coup d'etat on November the 7th, 1917, non-homogeneous political forces came to power. Because even if we talk about the fact that the socialist revolutionaries represented someone there, and then the insidious Bolsheviks a year later got rid of them, then this does not correspond to reality. Because the so-called Bolsheviks themselves were not homogeneous, because among them were true Marxists who knew about the fact that Marxism is not a scientific theory of building a real society in which there is no exploitation of man by man, but an ideological system that is supposed to manipulate society on the basis of certain objectives of global politics. This is directly Trotsky and others. And Lenin and Stalin and others, these are those who believe that socialism should be built in reality, and the exploitation of man by man should be eradicated. And in a society of free people, there will be manipulation of neither another person nor large social groups, because this is simply inappropriate for a society of free people.
То есть конфликт уже изначально был. Потом
That is, the conflict already existed from the very beginning. Then the question arises of how the establishment of Soviet power was perceived at the level of the common people. At the level of the common people, in many places, it was received very positively. And this is referred to in the history books of the Soviet era as the period of the triumphal march of Soviet power. That is, gatherings gathered everywhere on the ground. The gatherings elected the Soviets. The Soviets of the first level formed the Soviets of the second level, and thus a new statehood arose. And this statehood arose in a truly democratic way. And this real democracy, well, at least at the grassroots level, it remained until about the mid-1920s. But this real democracy was factually, functionally incapable, because 85% of the common people in Russia could not read or write. To say nothing of knowing what is within the competence of sociology, political science, economics, and finance, and all that, what is necessary for the organization and implementation of state governance. Therefore, the sign of Soviet power was preserved. But at the same time, the formation of a bureaucratic apparatus was underway, which actually formed a corporation alien to the people, and which lived according to the principle, took the reins, reap the gains. But bureaucracy is not a political subject. The bureaucracy needs a master. The 20s were a showdown over who would be the master of the bureaucracy, Trotsky or Stalin. In the end of the day, Stalin became the master of the bureaucracy, and Trotsky was sent abroad as unnecessary. Moreover, you see, if we talk about the conflict between the Stalin group and the Trotsky group, then if you do not know the theory of governance, do not interpret on the basis of the apparatus of theory of governance, the politics of that time, the governance towards the people's economy, then you get the impression that Trotsky was a true Democrat. That is, he was an opponent of the intra-party dictatorship, and he was in a way an opponent of the party dictatorship in relation to the whole of society. And Stalin allegedly was a despot, a tyrant, and therefore he persecuted the Democrat Trotsky, and in the end persecuted, expelled, and killed. But if you understand how it really is, then it turns out that Trotsky was interested in what is now called governed democracy. That is, the informed minority pretends to be Democrats in the party environment, sets a certain standard of behavior, and as a result of the procedure of democratic centralism, asserts and lends a rank of legitimacy to the opinion that was brewed somewhere in the backstage environment, and it was not brought out to the public. If you look at all of Trotsky's writings and look at what was written by Stalin in those years, this conflict arises on the theme of how to implement the entire function of governance in a state by the name of the Soviet Union. Further, it turns out that there is a governorial objective law which requires the mutual correspondence of the system of governance to the object of governance. That is, the statehood must correspond to the society that is under its governance, and society must also correspond to the statehood that exercises governance over it.
которая осуществляет власть над ним.
Again, if you look at how society lives, then the main factor in the life of society is collective psychodynamics. That is, these are egregors that generate societies and egregorial governance towards each personally, according to his egregorial status, volitional qualities, nraviousness, and everything else. Everything that concerns politics, the activity of each politician, also flows in the stream of this psychodynamics. And if this matter is understood, then it turns out that the Constitution of the USSR of 1936 was written for a society in which all healthy children, without exception, live under the power of a dictatorship of Soviet by the time of adolescence. They are volitional, their cognitive creative culture comes into possession of an effective methodology of cognition, and in principle, every intellectually healthy citizen of the Union can exercise жрец power.
И в принципе каждый интеллектуально здоровый гражданин Союза может осуществлять жреческую власть.
The system of education in the USSR did not provide an exit for the entire society to that level where each citizen is able to exercise жрец power, either on his own initiative or because others asked him to. In these conditions, it would be possible to wait until the system of education would bring people, new generations, to this level. Then the constitution of the Soviet Union would begin to correspond to society, and society could live in accordance with it. Because if to speak in essence, the constitution of the Soviet Union is truly the most democratic constitution that history has known. Moreover, the 1936 edition does not say anything about the leading role of the party. The party is one of the public organizations, and that's it. And Stalin's entire politics, from the Constitution of the 1936 to the 19th Congress, is an attempt to encourage society to transfer power from the party apparatus to the Soviets of laboring people's deputies. But the laboring people's deputies and the party masses, by virtue of social inertia, the inertia of this psychodynamics, they looked at Stalin as a Dobrist Tsar who runs the country, and, well, it's understandable that in such conditions, the variants in which the crisis-free development of the country would be realized are impossible. Because the party nomenclature really wanted to preserve this situation. And in response to the 1936 Constitution, it was precisely the party nomenclature who staged the repressions, the victims of which fell many of the initiators of the repressions. Well, further, Marxism was raised to the rank of dogma. What the exploitation of man by man is really, that is, how it looks in reality, and not how Marxism presents it. It was a taboo theme. Because it was declared that there was no exploitation in the Soviet Union, although, in reality, it went further the more the ruling party, the Soviet economic bureaucracy, became a social class and an exploiting class. Further, in the 70s it was such that in the USSR, it was possible to be dissatisfied with one of two things. The first variant, the fact that they started the project of building socialism and communism. It was necessary to live as all civilized people in the West live. The second variant of dissatisfaction is that they started the project of building socialism and communism. This is correct. But the fact that this construction is accompanied by mistakes and abuse of power, this is bad. Those who were dissatisfied with the first variant, this was mainly left-brain intelligentsia, the dissident intelligentsia, and again, as before 1917, this dissatisfied public had curators. But those who were dissatisfied with the fact that the construction of socialism and communism was accompanied by mistakes and abuses of power, these were really brutally suppressed. Because the Novocherkassk massacre and a lot of other things on this theme, which did not receive such publicity as the Novocherkassk massacre, this is the politics of the party Soviet nomenclature, which fought for its monopoly on power and for its right to exploit the rest of society under the conditions of the ideological Marxist-Leninist dictatorship. Again, if we analyze the difference between the eras of Stalin and post-Stalin times, then in Stalin's times, Marxism generally served as a lexical shell in which purpose-consonant governorial decisions were clothed. That is, Marxism was also used according to the principle of the law is the drawbar, where you turn it, there it goes. And Trotsky in the old days reproached Stalin precisely for perverting Marxism. That is, with Marxist phraseology, he pursues a policy that does not correspond to the global Marxist project. In the post-Stalinist era, the bureaucracy lost its internal master as such, because neither Khrushchev nor Brezhnev were its masters, but were its hostages. The bureaucracy became an exploiting class, and in the conditions of Russia, this means that it immediately loses the support of the people. Dissatisfaction with the fact that the Soviet Union was building socialism, it was realized through the political activity of dissident intelligentsia. But the dissatisfaction with the fact that the construction of socialism in the USSR was accompanied by mistakes and abuses, it was not even really conscious, because when Gorbachev came to power, he was trusted. That is, people in their majority, who made socialist elections, they hoped that under the leadership of Gorbachev, that the country would identify and eliminate the problems that had accumulated. If we talk about science, about the system of education, about economy, then the Soviet Union did not degrade to such an extent as to collapse as a result of exclusively internal reasons, as the liberals are trying to present. Well, on this theme, we recall the episode when the 15th anniversary of the State Emergency Committee was filmed in a documentary film on this theme. And Yegor Timurovich Gaidar was shown in commercials for several weeks, and he let slip the phrase. I have to say honestly, the CIA played a role. Well, it's understandable why Yegor Timurovich was given the wrong tea or something in Dublin, because from the point of view of the CIA, They created an image for you, both in Russia and abroad. They gave you the Institute for the Economy and Transition to feed on. Well, make some dough, puff out your cheeks, make a smart face, but why throw dirt on those who gave you all this? Therefore, the Soviet Union collapsed with outside help. But that this too did not quite follow the scenarios that the CIA had is also a fact. But this shows that the world behind the scenes is not God. Not everything is under its control. There are some components of the process that are locked directly on almightiness, unknown for the world behind the scenes. It is not prevented by it, and it is not governed by it. That is, in general, in brief, everything that can be said about the history of the Soviet Union. If we talk about the prospects, you see, then many of the prospects come from the noosphere and are expressed in primitive anecdotes, in sometimes absurd anecdotes. Here's an anecdote from the Brezhnev era. Two terminally ill men, a Russian and an American, are frozen. 100 years pass. Medicine has achieved incredible success. They are defrosted, cured. The guys come to their senses and ask to be told what is happening in the world. They turn on the television. The news program Vremya is on. The 36th Congress has elected Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev as General Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee. The American, ha ha ha. The next segment of the news. The collective farmers of the Ryazan and Oklahoma regions have entered into socialist competition for the delivery of overplanned grain to the granaries of their homeland. The Soviet Union was still there when this anecdote appeared. Only the most initiated guys knew about its impending collapse. But the anecdote already preemptively described the next era, which is inevitable for the simple reason that the liberal market economic model is a generator of suicidal for humanity scenarios. Therefore, if the United States and Europe want to live, then they will have to build real socialism in which both biology and medicine will guarantee the reproduction of biologically healthy generations, and family upbringing and school education will bring them to such a level of personal development that living under the power of the dictatorship of Soviets and possessing intellectual power, they will be such that it will be impossible to manipulate them. And then there will arise real democracy in which everyone will be free. And the free will of everyone will complement the free will of others in collective activity conflictlessly. Such a mode of life of society in the Russian tradition is called sobornost. There is no compulsion. Everything there is organic.
The position of Russia before the collapse of the Russian Empire and our current position now are very similar. Many things coincide. What was then, what is now.
And more than that, not only these things coincide, because the position of Russia now, it is similar to the position of Russia during the time of troubles or the times preceding the time of troubles. Moreover, not only in Russia, but also on a global scale. Because, according to some historians and geologists, the reason for a number of lean years during the reign of Boris Godunov was the explosion of one of the volcanoes somewhere in Indonesia. This led to a cooling as a consequence of atmospheric pollution for several years. Well, let's not once again draw parallels between personal biographies, but recall that the United States lives on Yellowstone. And a number of analysts show that global politics in relation to the United States of the last 20 years is politics that takes into account the possibility that Yellowstone will go bang. Those who are spiteful on this theme and yearn for Yellowstone to go bang, you after all need to bethink yourself. Because if Yellowstone goes bang, then the whole planet will know about this, although North America will certainly get the most. Therefore, in global politics, at the global level, there is also some matrix egregorial repetitions. And the fact that humanity really solves Nravi's ethical tasks in a certain way by the method of successive approximations, this is a fact. And it's expressed in the fact that the internal situation in Russia, the global situation as a whole, if we take out of consideration the technosphere, scientific technological progress and its results over the past several centuries, then very much will resemble the era of the times preceding the times of troubles in the late 16th, early 17th centuries.
It turns out that nothing good awaits us.
Why? It all depends on how we implement the possibilities. If we take the position that the state is for us, I am a small person, what can I alone do? Liberals are in the driving seat, then there will be a global catastrophe. Well, not in a year or two, but in the foreseeable future, precisely because the liberal market economic model is a generator of all kinds of disasters. Moreover, in historical development, it is an increasingly powerful generator.
Taking into account technical progress, it's becoming more and more powerful.
Yes. If we take the position that the state, this is us, and we roll out our own project of globalization, then we have support and will realize this project successfully. And it is being realized for the simple reason that God never intended to do for people that which they can do themselves, what they must do themselves, in order not to be talking monkeys. With an atomic grenade or with a crossbow, this is a different question. But in order to take place in the quality of human. To take place in the quality of human means working first of all on oneself and helping others in this kind of work. Further, to the measure of personal development, personal possibilities for impacting the course of both natural and social processes increase.
So should the cook learn to govern the state?
Yes, the cook must learn how to govern the state. In principle, this slogan was in the 20s, but then it was somehow pushed aside.
You know, many cooks, of course, want to govern the state. Another thing is that they have no knowledge for this.
The point is not that they want to govern the state. The point is that if society really develops, then knowledge is only a dowry to the type of structure of the psyche. And the position of a normal human, if the process goes right, then what meaning is there in interfering with it? There is no ambition. If ambition creeps in, then it's obvious to others, because if you recall the times of the 27th Congress, the future president of Russia, Yeltsin, appeared on the podium and spoke for about 10 minutes. Few gave him the correct description then. Basically, people looked at it like it did not concern them, or for many, Boris Yeltsin was charismatic, thanks to which he became president. If people were really people, they would have seen the falsity and political inconsistency of all this beforehand. And in this case, he either would not have become president, or he would have been told, "Borya, go and study." He would have gone to study, because the principle, "I am the boss, you are a fool, you are the boss, I am a fool," also does not work in a normal human society. Well, we live in general in flabbergasting conditions, as well as other so-called democratic societies. You see, in order to drive a car, you need to go to driving courses, at least a month or two. In order to fly an airplane, the USSR required a higher technical education. In order to rule the state, it is enough to win the election campaign.
And to beautifully speak without a piece of paper.
Yes, or to beautifully speak. But in such conditions, the politics proceeds according to the principle, he who knows, he will understand, and he who does not know or is not able to understand, this is his problem. Ready or not?
What, ready or not? The state is like a big boat for everyone.
The state is two components. It is statehood, that is, deputies, officials, some officers that provide consulting services, and a society subject to the statehood, occupying a certain territory within the borders of this state. The question is, how does society generate statehood, or how does statehood generate itself? Because there are two variants. Either society generates statehood, and this process is continuous, and then statehood corresponds to society. Or statehood separates itself from society and says, at least in its own closed circles, that people will swallow all that. Your duty is to be loyal and not to get involved in politics. Another question is how to arrange it.
It is very curious that in our country, this leads to the collapse of the state of both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. And the United States has been living according to that system for a long time, and no collapses happen with them.
But because they have an internal mafia, which is ideologized by order, and which manipulates the so-called democracy. This internal mafia is the very same Freemasonry. But if someone says to American Freemasonry, "Come on, get out of politics," then the states will collapse within a decade.
They don't say yet.
They don't say yet.
What should we do then, if we have such a bad situation? Who are our governors? This is a class of people who have everything abroad. It is even worse than in the Russian Empire on the eve of its fall. That is, our head is there, everything is there, All the accounts are there.
Even when Brzezinski
Brzezinski
said, "You figure out whose elite is this. Their money is with us, the children study with us." But you see, this is not the first time in the history of Russia, because if you look at the history of Russia, or the multinational Russian civilization, then there is a certain periodicity. This periodicity was discussed in the work The Time of Troubles in the Rus.
Об этой периодичности речь шла в работе «Смута на Руси».
Here comes the elite, which looks down on the rest of society. We are better than them. We have the right. Everyone else should be grateful for the fact that we, the elite, we rule, we take care of them. The Russian elite, by strength of a number of reasons, above all high conceit, is creatively sterile. It begins to want to live like more civilized neighbors. Who were more civilized neighbors from its point of view? Byzantium. Well, it takes several centuries for Byzantium to collapse. The Tsardom of Moscow emerges. The ruling elite, what a pity, you have to serve the Tsar, but if anything, the Tsar takes your head off your shoulders. It would be nice, like in Poland, when the gentry elects the Tsar and spins him as it pleases. Several centuries pass, several partitions of Poland. Oh, how good the Germans are, or the French. France and Germany suffer catastrophes. There is a revolution in France. Germany is also suffering catastrophe. Well, now the elite in our country looks, oh, how it is in the States, oh, how good it is there. In general, knowing these regularities of Russian history and its interconnections with global history, it remains only to say, poor United States. If we turn to the internal periodicity of Russian history, then it turns out like this. After another catastrophe, an attempt arises to build an all-people state. The all-people state is being built, successfully developing. Then an elite appears in its depths, which says, we are better than them, and the elite wants an elitarian state. The elite arranges in one form or another a state coup d'etat. There arises an elitarian state, which the elite degrades, brings to a collapse, and again a new all-people state arises. This is the cyclics of Russian history. The last time an all-people state was built was under the leadership of Stalin after 1917. In 1953, a state coup d'etat was launched with the murder of Stalin and Beria, which the people generally did not perceive in the quality of a state coup d'etat. And this state coup d'etat ended 40 years later in 1993 with the juridical formation of the current constitution. This is the constitution of an elitarian state that plays in democratic procedures in order to hide its essence. Plus, the situation is aggravated by the fact that we again have a tribal system, and our elite statehood is again degrading. There is only one alternative to catastrophe. People who understand this algorithmics, who master the necessary knowledge for the implementation of social governance, they work to transform both society and the state. In this case, we have the possibility to avoid this catastrophe become the leader of the civilizational development of all humanity. Moreover, if we talk about the prospects for the civilizational development of all humanity and Russia's leadership in this process, it turns out that this will not be the dictatorship of the Russian military power or the Russian economy. Here there is something completely different. There are 6 groups of objective laws to which the life of any society is subordinate. These are biospheric objective laws, species-specific, religious noospheric, nravious ethical objective laws, socio-cultural objective laws, economic objective laws, and governorial objective laws. There are 6 groups of them. They are one for us, for Canadians, for Americans, for those living in Africa or Australia. Only pan-biospheric and socio-cultural ones give some specifics, because culture is largely conditioned by the biocenoses in which it originated. But all the same, this is a single objective law. If you want to live in a problem-free society, regardless of whether you are an African, Chinese, Russian, Jew, then you must build life in the region in which you live, relying on these objective laws, so that humanity does not generate a whole slew of problems. Therefore, the Russian project of globalization, it does not provide for violence as such, it provides for enlightenment. But if we talk about who, when, first spoke about this, to all appearances, Khomyakov. He has a poem about Russia in 1839. In the materials of the conception, it was quoted several times. Another question is whether we want to follow this path, or we take a dependent position. The state is for us, let them provide us with everything, and we ourselves are only present. We want to work at a minimum and somehow also get more. Then again, you see, there are 2 literary characters. The Great Inquisitor of Dostoevsky and the Great Schemer of Ilfen Petrov. The Stalinist regime is accused of being a general variation of the regime of the Grand Inquisitor. And the liberal regime, this is the regime of the Great Schemer. That is, as Ostap Bender said, I respect the criminal code, but at the same time I know 100 approximately honest ways to make money. From the point of view of a laborer, the regime of the Grand Inquisitor is preferable, because in the conditions of the regime of the Grand Inquisitor, the norms are clear, following which you guarantee safety for yourself and for your loved ones, and a certain level of welfare of social security, because the regime of the Grand Inquisitor is a kind of social corporation, even if hierarchical. But the Grand Inquisitor, in order for it to exist, must ensure its stability and the suppression of any anti-systemic manifestations. From the point of view of the Great Schemer, whom the Grand Inquisitor does not allow to scheme, this is tyranny. If the regime of the Grand Inquisitor degrades, then great schemers appear under the slogans freedom, 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 freedom. And they set up a regime of the Great Schemer that doesn't guarantee anything to anyone.
режимом Великого Инквизитора и режимом Великого Комбинатора. Если говорить о
Well, if you look
России,
at the history
то
of many countries, then
Достоевский
these are the
режимом Великого
fluctuations of the pendulum
Инквизитора
between the
видел
regime of the Grand Inquisitor
история,
and the
возбудил
regime of the
некоторую
Great
часть
Schemer.
интеллигенции на
If we
тему о
talk
том,
about
что
Russia,
Великого Инквизитора это плохо. Но
then
интеллигенция
Dostoevsky, the legend of the
проигнорировала
Grand Inquisitor,
предупреждение
aroused some
эпохи
part of the intelligentsia on the
мертвых
theme
душах
that the
о
power of
власти
the Grand
Великого
Inquisitor
Комбинатора,
is bad.
что мертвые души
But the
возвращаются
intelligentsia
к
ignored
опасным
Gogol's
векам,
warning
а
in
Великий
Dead Souls
Комбинатор Чичиков
about the power of the Great Schemer,
это еще тот
because Dead
срок,
Souls,
если
this is still
представить,
serfdom,
что
and
высшая
the Great Schemer,
интеллигенция продает
Chichikov,
власть за ним,
is a real piece of work.
то мало не покажется. Когда появился
But if
Остап
we imagine
Ибрагимов
that the
в
highest
литературном
intrasocial power is
это
behind
было
him, we
воспринято,
will all know about it.
на уровне хихи-ха-ха и повлекло массу подражаний. Масса подражаний
When Ostap
выразилась в том,
Ibrahimovich
что
Bender
после
appeared as a
90-х
literary
годов
character,
краха СССР
he was accepted. It was accepted at the level of laughs and giggles and entailed a lot of imitations.
возник режим Великого Комбинатора.
The mass of imitations was expressed in the fact that after 1991 and the collapse of the USSR, as the degraded regime of the Grand Inquisitor, a regime of the Great Schemer emerged. And the liberals miss Yeltsin's times precisely because it was a regime of great schemerism, when it was possible to scheme and grow without generally answering for anything. But when the question of Stalin's regime comes up, then it turns out that, yes, he performed the tasks that are solved by the regime of the Grand Inquisitor, but along with this, he solved those tasks that the regime of the Grand Inquisitor never thinks about, and the attempt to solve which it suppresses. In particular, the legend of the Grand Inquisitor, when Christ appears as the carrier of those tasks that the Grand Inquisitor is not intending to solve, the Grand Inquisitor immediately suggests taking him into custody and promises to execute him. But it's another matter that after the night talk, Christ leaves the city, and Stalin solved those problems that were supposed to lead society out of this swinging of the pendulum between the regime of the Grand Inquisitor and the regime of the Great Schemer, because in Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, he directly writes that education should be such that everyone can become active participants in social development. You can become an active participant in social development only in the case that you know all these 6 groups of objective laws. You see their manifestations in real life. You see how to rely on them so that the life of society is glorious, and what needs to be done in order to block negative manifestations and negative possibilities when these objective laws can destroy society or create some problems in it. Well, this circumstance is the answer to the question why all attempts at de-Stalinization of Soviet society and post-Soviet society always come to a standstill. And many people who start as de-Stalinizers, well, the same Anatoly Wasserman, eventually come to the conclusion that Stalin was right. But this, again, can be understood, it can be expressed in lexicon, provided that cognition is not of a textual bookish character, but at the basis of cognition and creativity are senses, intuition, and the sense of measure, including the sense of that matrix of the predetermination of being, in which all processes flow, and which contain in themselves a great many variants for the future, but only one variant is realized. And if we are methodologically, cognitively, functionally capable, then from the whole plurality of possible variants, we can choose the best one and realize it. Another question, do we want to? Either we have more important things to do, such as football is shown on television, or we agreed with friends to go to barbecue with brandy.
How, in which way, can the majority of people actually want it? Since a fairly large part of people don't even bother with any kind of governance, especially state governance.
If we again consider social processes on historically long intervals of time, then, in relation to the future, the decisive role is played not by the opinions of this majority, which lives in accordance with the life standard of its era and does not bother about it. The future is determined by minorities. Either minorities who pull the Overton window towards degradation, or those minorities who block degradational processes and stimulate some part, first of all, of the younger generations to ensure that they become human. The future is determined by these. Moreover, if we talk about the ways of realizing this, well, imagine such a situation that Alexander III, when they bring him a decree on the cook's children, puts the question simply, what are you doing? Are you completely crazy? Industry is developing, military affairs are developing, abroad there is a lot of everything. Who will defend Russia? Instead of this decree, let's write, if you cannot, I will write a decree on the creation of imperial schools for gifted children, regardless of their origin. The schools will be located in the vicinity of St. Petersburg. The Tsar will regularly travel to these schools, communicate with the children himself once a week on every weekend, participate in children's games, play trains with them. Children will climb on his knees and cry about their childhood troubles. 1887. The year 1907. Where are these children?
In the army, in officials.
In the army, in officials. Moreover, a fair share of them remember how they sat on the lap of the Tsar father, how he wiped away their children's tears. After that, someone appears and says, you know, Russia is not democratic. Everything is not as it is due. It is necessary to change. What will happen?
At best, they will be beaten.
You see, a completely different social situation arises, which, in the long term, leads to a smooth dismantling of the straighter caste system as unnecessary, which happened in Japan. But in Russia, this, in principle, could have happened better if, instead of the decree on cook's children, there was a decree on the creation of imperial schools for children of all classes. Factually, this system would reproduce an intellectual опричнина. And, over time, this system would supplant everything else. That is, it could have been done. Because, indeed, this is a minority. It decides the future. It determines the future. But the question is how the state power relates to this minority. Because if the state power suppresses this minority, then this minority realizes its creative potential as revolutionaries, subversives of the regime. Well, look, Stalin, Mikhail, Beria, and so on and so forth. These are people who were denied the possibility of realizing their creative potential in the Russian Empire. How did they realize it? They created a new state. If the Russian Empire demanded their creative potential, we may have known the same names, but in the lists of prominent figures of the Russian Empire. Because if in childhood the creative potential was not stifled, and a person has a destiny, the realization of which is presupposed, then the realization is possible in two ways, either with the support of an established culture, or, in the extreme case, on account of eliminating this culture and building a new state, a new culture. Well, in conditions of a tribal system, the second variant usually works.
Then everything turns out much worse than it seems at first glance with our situation.
With our situation, it turns out like this, that if this creative minority is now not oriented on demolishing this bureaucracy by military force and instituting something new, then it will make sure that the process proceeds evolutionarily, and, if possible, without excesses. Well, since there is such a minority, then if the bureaucracy does not insist that it wants alternativeless collapse and catastrophe, then the variant of evolutionary development, transformation of the country, global civilization, it will be realized. And from this vicious cyclics, catastrophe or people state, elitization, catastrophe or people state, we will egress. We will enter an all-people state, which will carry the entirety of the function of governance and will not be a system of violence against society by its internal and external politics, because society will also be different. The thesis of Marxism that the state will die out is false, for the simple reason that as long as society needs professional governance towards affairs of social as a whole significance, the state as a system of professional governance will exist. But if a society is obviously ethically homogeneous, then a saying of the type, "I love my motherland and hate the state," will be incomprehensible.
Alas, the nervous ethical homogeneity of society is still very far away. Society, on the other hand, is becoming even more stratified.
Society, on the one hand, is becoming even more stratified, but on the other hand, the minority that shapes the future is still being formed. It is taking shape, it is increasing its functional capability. You cannot get away from this.
That is, it turns out that we again have a chance to form an all-people state. That is, either we do it, or we again get something like a civil war, general murder, and difficult years. And as a matter of fact, it largely depends on the people themselves.
Yes, it always depends on the people themselves, because external factors can only have an impact when inside there is a responsive environment.
A question concerning the time. Exactly in 2 years, 2017, is the centenary of the revolution. Is the current situation fundamentally different from the one that was 100 years ago? Or something better or something worse?
It is different, for the simple reason that now the social strata that can be involved in a riot are much narrower. Plus, Ukraine has shown that the Maidan is an aggravation of problems, not their solution.
But the fact that there are a lot of various social organizations, sobriety organizations, how is in general to understand this?
Well, what? Many public organizations, this is inevitable. People have some interests. If there are initiatives related to these interests, they are implemented through social organizations. If the range of interests expands, because the question, well, even about sobriety, for the sake of what? For the sake of health. And health for the sake of what? After all, bodies are not meant for eternal life anyway. How do you answer this question? On the one hand, there was a discussion of the question of absolute sobriety on one of the talk shows. So the talk show came out several times to the question, to get drunk out of your mind. This is understandable. To get away from reality, there is a buzz, everything is fine, it's understandable. But why drink culturally? That is, not get drunk out of your mind to the point of loss of self-composure. And this question arose several times and no answer was ever given to it. And the answer to this question is generally impossible, for the simple reason that a person, if he has worked out the skills of self-mastery, is aware of what sophist is, what is will, well, he guesses about the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious levels of the psyche, understands the function of emotions in the psyche. He is a person, an emotionally self-sufficient being. That is, drinking in order to get into a good mood is not an answer to the question, and there are no other answers.
Well, then, summing up our conversation with you, it turns out that the future of the state directly depends on each person, simply personally, not that I'm small, it's not my business, I don't know anything, I don't know how, and in general no one listens. That is, each one personally, each person personally, should be engaged in their own development. But development is not that he lifts weights there, but the development of his own personality.
Not only weights, but also the development of one's own personality, broadening one's horizons, knowledge, mastering skills, working out nravious determinus in relation to what is happening in the country and in the world, and accordingly then direct possibilities open up to impact processes through the noosphere, through the egregorial system of civilization.
That is, some endeavors can be done, directly participating in social life.
Yes, and some of the things you can do just before going to bed, already under the covers, and thinking about what has happened in the world and what you would like. As shown in the notorious film The Matrix, when the Oracle bakes cookies in the kitchen, but in this film this is not her main business, she rules something from the kitchen. But the Oracle in the Matrix egregorially governs the course of processes against the background of the fact that she bakes cookies. Cookies are an outwardly visible activity, and she talks about the rest of the activity insofar as is necessary for the development of the plot.
Understandable. That is, you can deal with cookies, including running the state along the way, to some extent.
All the best until next time.